We're just gonna start with me laughing. So Paul said something incredibly funny after. All right. Hey everyone, my name's Lee Petty, and I'm the project lead of Keeper. And I'd like to talk about some of the inspirations behind the game, because people often ask me like, well, so why did you want to make a game about a walking lighthouse? And it's not really a straight line for my inspirations to a walking lighthouse, but I think in talking about all these ideas in these various inspirations that kind of fueled the development of Keeper, you might understand a little bit where I'm coming from. And it's also always worth mentioning that these are my inspirations as the project lead, but all the team kind of brings their own experience and inspirations to the game as well. And that's one of the great things about making a piece of art with a group of people, is that it just becomes richer than it could from a single person. But probably my biggest inspiration for Keeper is a really simple one, which is just nature. And during the pandemic, I found that hiking became an even greater comfort and a source of inspiration than normally. It was one of the few things that I could do, and they were actually far less crowded, the trails. And so I found really easy to kind of get in this meditative state walking around and start to wonder about all the things we were probably all thinking about at the time. Like, is this it for us? Like, what's the future of life on this planet? And, you know, if humanity was gone, or let's say we're set in an era past humanity's time in the sun, what would life do? And in imagining where life might develop without us, I didn't want it to seem too rational. You know, I thought it'd be much more interesting to just kind of imagine almost the impossible, like a rock becoming sentient, or fusing with something else and co-evolving into a different type of creature than we imagined before. And when I started researching for ideas about creatures and evolution, one of the things I remembered and one of the things I came upon were these sort of old naturalist journals or illustrations. It's very clear in a lot of these, the person drawing had never actually seen the animal, but someone had just described it to them. So, you know, they might be illustrating a giraffe, and this artist has never seen a giraffe because it's really just like a dog with an enormous neck and some spots thrown on. And I just found that stuff fascinating, how, you know, it's like a game of telephone. But they're actually much more interesting than the actual animals. And then another big influence on me in general is film, movies. I love movies. And for The Keeper, there is a kind of group of films. And I think probably the most influential of this group of films would be The Dark Crystal. What I loved about The Dark Crystal is such amazing inventive visual design and execution. But it's really unusual because the tone is not quite like a kid's movie. It's got some really dark themes, but it's also full of hope and wonder. And when I first saw it, I was like, I don't think I've seen anything like any of those creatures ever. Like every single one of those creature designs and set designs were just so cool and different. And it's not a perfect movie, but what I liked about that movie and all these movies I'm going to talk about is that they're just so earnest. Like they just feel very not self-conscious. I think they're self-aware, but they don't care that they're perfect. They feel like they're made by people. They feel like, you know, craftsmen drove the development of those movies, and they made different choices. And that, for me, is what made them stand the test of time. And so in thinking about, like, well, what's this world I want? What's the tone? What am I feeling right now? And it's this weird, unusual mix of hope and melancholy and dark stuff, but also like really colorful and vibrant elements. And yeah, Dark Crystal is a great one for that. Return to Oz was another one that, especially one of the visual effects artists on the team, Jeremy Mitchell, is a huge fan of this movie, and I like it as well. There's some really creepy puppets and practical effects in that movie. I think there's like is it the Gnome King or Goblin King? I can't remember, the sort of like one that forms out of the stone with these weird faces. There's definitely something I thought about a lot. You know, in Keeper, there's a lot of things that kind of morph or transform from one thing into another, and that movie had some of that, and it was just, I won't say it's charming. For me, it's charming. It was kind of done in a way that wasn't off-putting because of this sort of layer of puppets there. It didn't feel like a horror movie or anything like that. Very close to those movies in some ways is A Never-Ending Story, probably even more 80s. But that one also had just a lot of really, again, dark themes. This fantasy world is ending from lack of imagination. Like, what could be cooler than that, right? And you've got these weird characters, this unlikely group of characters working together. You've got like this incredibly fast snail, and you've got this giant person made out of rock. They don't even make much attention to these, how strange these character designs. There's like these weird like living heads just off the sidelines. There's just such cool stuff hidden around the periphery. And it's almost like you had to like pause and rewind your VHS tape to kind of find like all those little characters. I love that. It felt like I was exploring and seeing that stuff that maybe other people didn't see. And I'm gonna put this one in it, and this is kind of a little bit different, but also Kroll is another huge inspiration for me. It's just such a strange movie where it's got this sort of demon character who lives in this like crazy castle. And both castle and that demon look like something Geiger would have designed back then, right? And you've got that next to like a Cyclops, which is probably one of the goofiest looking characters in that movie. It made no sense, but I loved it. It was just so strange. And it just, like I said, it was just so earnest in its desire to create this world. And maybe that's what all those have in common for me, is that they just wanted to create a world that was different than what other people had done. And they didn't care that it was perfect. I'm sure they were doing their best. But they took chances that they probably knew would not be for everyone. And yeah, this the energy in those movies. I tried to bring something like that to Keeper. And also a big influence is animation in general. Like many people, I think Miyazaki is amazing. And some of my favorite films of his are Nausicaa Valley of the Wind and Princess Mononoke. You know, nature is just a strong sort of character or force in both of those movies. And to some extent, the folly of humankind interacting with nature. I remember just being blown away by like those sort of toxic forest. It's just so beautiful and magical, but it's just growing out of, you know, toxicity, right? It's not coming from a good place, but it's still just beautiful in an almost alien way. Similarly, Mononoke, the way they depicted the sort of forest spirits and a lot of that sort of stuff in that movie, that was just, again, not like anything I'd ever seen. And maybe it's coming from a cultural background I don't have, but either way, it just felt like it had created its own space and way of representing nature that I loved. And thinking about Miyazaki, thinking about those films got me thinking about just this like broad category of I'm just gonna call it weird European animation that I love. And for this game in particular, Fantastic Planet was one of these films that I think I first saw it as a kid, like on a laser disc at a friend's house or something. I don't remember where I saw it. They kind of mumble speak in it, and it's just like very strange. And it's kind of a horrifying movie, even though it's not really. You know, the humans are kind of being dominated by these weird, strange creatures, and there's this whole ecosystem of what's going on there with these aliens, and you don't really understand it, but it's beautiful and fascinating to me. It kind of reminded me, it's like a nature journal, you know, for another alien planet somehow. You kind of stumbled upon that. I really loved that movie in particular. And that reminded me, again, recently there's been a series out called Scavenger's Reign, but when I started this project, which was before that came out, I remember the short just called Scavengers from, I think, 2016, but it's also wordless. And I found that to be very powerful. And again, it felt like they kind of created their own sense of world, like you were encountering this world that had all of its own rules or ways that these creatures and nature worked there, and you just didn't know what it was. And so the characters in this animated short are sort of stumbling upon and have learned to harness some of these weird things, but they're not really explained to you as the viewer. You're not even entirely sure if they know what they are. It just felt really interesting, like it was clearly inspired by nature and the inner workings of nature, but it kind of just went in a direction that I was not expecting at all, and it was really powerful for such a short work. Another thing that I really love in general is stop motion animation, and in particular, the brothers Quay and their work. Street of Crocodiles is probably their most known work. It's really hard to describe their work, but it's really beautiful. It feels like you're watching someone's dream or a stream of consciousness. All the characters and sets look like they're made from found objects that have been repurposed, and in some case, heavily modified to the extent that maybe you don't even recognize at first that there's found objects in there with them. But they're really just have like an unearthly quality and really kind of almost haunting music in some cases. And again, they're not horror movies. I wouldn't say they're hopeful works, but they're just mysterious, and you have just an uneasy feeling watching them. One of the things I really liked about them was just the physicality in there. Like you could just see the craftsmanship, and this is true of all stop motion. You know, some of the stuff I love about earlier stop motion is they haven't figured out how to like hide all the human hand in there, you know, or the weird slight differences that happen in lighting over time, or characters' hair or thumbprints, all those different things that can happen in stop motion. And when we were thinking about Keeper, you know, painting, of course, was a big inspiration. When thinking about what does painting mean to like sculpting characters in a game, you know, it started to veer into a little bit of a stop motion. The idea that these characters have a little bit of almost like a quality of clay to them. And if you look at our character models in Keeper, you'll see things like rake marks and not thumbprints or anything quite on the nose that much. We don't have a lot of shiny stuff, for example. So it has a certain kind of almost clay hand touch quality to that as well. And that came a lot from the Brothers Quay and stop motion animation in general. Yeah, and talking more about film and some directors in particular that I've found inspiring, Lynch is certainly one of them, David Lynch. I've been a longtime fan of his work. And it's not just his work, it's the way he chooses to make his movies. They just feel very confident in their own thing. And I love that about him and his work. And when he talks about his work, you can see he'll often talk about his influences, but he won't answer specific questions about like, well, what does this exact thing mean?
And the second it's finished, people want you to change it back into words. And it's very, very saddening. It's a torture.
And for me, that's important, right? When you're creating art, it's not about you have a hidden little cheat sheet that you're just not willing to tell anyone. That's not really how art works, I don't think. And so, he's not even fully aware of what all those things mean. He knows the influences, he knows some of the ideas, but any given moment of a movie is not like a hidden code for you to find, I think. And it's that dreamlike quality that he has in his films and his willingness to, I think, go for something he has a feeling for, an instinct or an artistic idea without knowing all the answers, and work with a group of people to create it without knowing all that. Like that's a certain sort of artistic bravery and a really cool process, because that idea then changes when you're working with a different group of people. And for me, that's kind of like how we made Keeper a bit, I had very specific ideas about parts of the game, but as we started developing it, those things change. And part of that was the team's input. Part of it was just sitting and living it for a while and realizing that a lot of the major themes were still there, but other themes I hadn't realized were actually there from the start. And then, figuring out ways to emphasize and weave those in and out. And I guess Lynch really is just inspiring to me in that way. And a very different director, but I'll kind of mention him in a similar way, is Jodorowsky, probably best known for Holy Mountain, which is probably still my favorite work of his. But he's just so inspiring to listen to, talk about his work and his process of creating. And, I feel like sometimes in video games we feel very limited in ways that maybe film has somehow found a way to break out of sometimes. And I think I just took a lot of inspiration from that approach. And his stuff is just nonsense, and on one level, just absolute surrealistic nonsense that I love. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but also it's got heart in it. It's got something else to it. And, I could only, just great stuff. And lastly, and again, very different directors, all these folks I'm mentioning, but David Cronenberg is another sort of long time inspiration for me. And, he's of course best known for his take on body horror, but also identity and the idea of self and how that expresses it in a corporeal form with the body, and how that body can change, and what does that mean to identity. Those are themes he explores a lot. Those are themes I'm really interested in. And I think those are themes that we touch on a lot with Keeper in a very sort of unusual, metamorphic way where things can change over time throughout the course of the game. Yeah, so painters in general are inspiration for me. I went to school as a painter. I love painting. One of my earliest inspirations when I was getting into painting was surrealism, and probably Dali being the best known for most folks. Currently, we're kind of in this sort of new literalism phase, right, where like everything has to be very rational, everything has to be very explained. And I like that in both Dada and surrealism, they were interested in exploring ways where they could almost remove authorial control and then respond to that. So a lot of them would, of course, famous for dreamlike energy and trying to tap into the unconscious, and they were, they're sort of Freud, Jungian type stuff. And so looking to those painters was a big inspiration. And but it wasn't just Dali and the use of dreamlike imagery. Another example that I like is Max Ernst, who was a pretty influential artist. Less known, he's not only a painter, he did a lot of collage and other things. And one of the techniques he developed that I found really fascinating is this technique called grattage, where he would take physical objects and put them under a canvas, and then use like very watery or oiled down paint and create almost random shapes from the impression and let it kind of dry, or maybe move it around a bit. And then from there, he'd kind of paint these landscapes. And some people connected them into sort of like war-torn Europe after World War I. Either way, they're just these amazing, beautiful things that the starting point for him was something that was not under his direct control. But then, of course, as he's painting it, he's turning it into something. And a few of those paintings were big influences on the landscapes in Keeper. And when we were talking about what we wanted the world to look like, one of the things I knew from the start is I wanted the world to be expressive and gestural. You know, while we certainly did have some kits, the world team really embraced this idea of just like hand sculpting so much of the world. It's so bespoke and different, and a lot of that just came from this idea that we wanted everything to feel kind of alive and have that sense of organic variation and sense of gesture and expression to it. And a lot of that came from these painters we're talking about. And I think part of that too is if you look at surrealism, one of the other techniques they would sometimes use or ideas is they would sometimes treat a hard surface thing as soft, or a soft thing as hard, or something that's small as huge. Like they would kind of change that context a bit and change its meaning. So, you know, Dali again is probably best known for his painting with the sort of floppy clock laying over the branch, right? Like that's like a hard surface thing, but it's weird because it's soft. And so even though we have a lot of rocks and things like that, their forms are almost treated as if they're like a brushstroke or something that could be alive. And indeed, we do have living rocks in the game. A surrealist, Baczynski, is pretty well known, and his stuff is fairly horror-like. But again, one of the things that I really respond to in his work is it's colorful, even though it's quite dark content. And a lot of times you see something like a rock, but it looks like it has veins or fingers in it, or some like organic tissue you can't quite identify. So it's not like gore. It's not straight up horror or slasher or anything like that. For me, it's inspiring because it's got this sense of life and something that does not look like it should be alive. And I think from there we could talk about some of the sort of, I guess I call them like post-psychedelic painters like Roger Dean or early Michael Whelan or Bruce Pennington. And what's interesting there is, you know, psychedelia and psychedelic art was really partially inspired, try to represent the idea of being on some sort of, you know, drug trip visually. And these artists weren't really focused on that, but what they did is they sort of like were influenced by some of that art. So they took from that, they sort of like really almost acidic colors and unexpected elements being put together, and a sense, like an organic sense, showed up in their work. That's just a few of the inspirations for Keeper. There's actually a lot more. It'd be so hard to talk about all of them. But one of the great things about art, about games, about movies, about books is that you bring your own inspirations and your own influences to that when you play or engage in that work of art. And for me, when I think about inspirations, it's important that we take inspiration from these sources, but don't imitate the sources, right? You want to recognize this work that's come before you, but you know, it's our desire to create something new, and we always try and do that at Double Fine. So in sharing these inspirations, we want you to sort of understand where we're coming from, but we'd love to hear where you're coming from. I can't wait for people to play this game and kind of say, oh, this reminded me of this movie or this book. And I could see how it connected to similar themes there. That makes it really rewarding for me as a creator, and I love engaging in other people's work that way myself. So please, when you play Keeper, share your ideas. We'd love to hear them.